Edwin Canistracci here, and we are rocking with Dokken. Yeah, always want to say that in one of these videos. You know, I've been waiting, biding my time for when I was going to drop a Dokken video on you guys. It was like, when am I going to do this? And just last week, I got a new release from Dokken, The Lost Songs, 1978 to 1981. And it's a compilation of older demos that Don Dokken had discovered, and he put some new vocals and added some guitar parts and stuff to a couple of these songs. Plus, he put it together with a remastered version of the Back in the Streets EP, which is early 1979 recordings of Dokken with an early lineup before George Lynch and the classic lineup formed a few years before that. And that was only available in bootlegs for many, many years. So it's cool to get a remastered version of that, plus with these demo songs and listening to it. I'm not going to tell you what I think yet. I'm going to save that for the end of the discography review. But it inspired me to do this video, and I said, yeah, let's do Dokken. I'm in the mood. There was a few of their later albums I wasn't as familiar with. I owned pretty much everything except for the last one, and a few others that I did own, some of the later ones, but I don't listen to them too much, so I kind of dived back. Plus their first album, which I actually hadn't listened to a lot, or at least I hadn't listened to it for a long time, so I kind of got reacquainted with that one a lot. I actually ended up listening to that album quite a bit the past couple weeks. So did the deep dive, and now I feel like, yeah, I can do this. I can talk Dokken. And I'm going to give you a little backstory. As some of you might know from some of my other videos, I have this older brother that I reference a lot. My older brother is 5 years older than me, and he's always 5 years older than me. That keeps on being 5 years older than me. And he was 5 years older than me back in the day, back in the 80s. And he was into the hair metal. He was very into the hair metal. He had the big hair too. He looked like the night songs, Cinderella. He had very big hair. And his, I was still just in elementary school, and he was like entering high school. So, obviously a little guy looked up to him in the 80s, and he was dating pretty blondes and driving around in a red Firebird and blasting the Dokken and Cinderella. So, as you can imagine, that seems pretty cool to me. It was very different from my high school years, which were in the grunge era, where it was all flannels and depressing. Definitely looking back, I was like, hey, he had a cooler high school experience than me. But as a kid, for the most part, even though I thought it was cool and, some of this stuff, but, I was still a little too young to get into it. When I got a little bit older, like entered junior high, most of the stuff he listened to, I wasn't so into. I got into Aerosmith and Guns N' Roses, and that was my gateway to what I discovered was the kind of music I was really into, which was a lot of 70s hard rock, like classic hard rock from the 70s. And I got very into AC/DC, and before you know it, I was getting into thrash and Metallica, and then a few years later, I'd be into like Nirvana. So that was more my brother's era music. Hair metal was more his era music than mine. But that being said, Dokken was a band I liked. That was like I thought of it as like one of my brother's bands. Like that was a band he really liked a lot. And he had posters and all kinds of Dokken. Like he was a really huge Dokken fan, and he actually still likes him. He's still a fan. And they were like the group that I probably swiped his CDs and cassettes of Dokken more than anything else. So I do have a soft spot for Dokken because they were one of like the early bands that I kind of got into and listened to. I didn't need to buy all their albums though, because my brother already had them all. So I didn't like do that thing with the Columbia House or go back and search out their albums because my brother had them all. So I just, whenever I felt like listening to one of them, I would swipe it for my brother. And especially Tooth and Nail, that was one I was drawn to very early on. I remember my brother had the cassette of Breaking the Chains and Tooth and Nail. And Tooth and Nail had this awesome cassette cover right there. Ooh, very cool, very demonic looking. These two hands. It was creepy. I remember thinking, oh, this looks creepy. It's like from a horror movie. It's very cool. It wasn't until years later that I discovered that was actually different from the CD and the vinyl album cover, which was still cool, but not as cool as that cassette cover. That cassette cover was pretty badass. And the first CD that my brother ever bought, I believe, I could be wrong, but I think it was in 1987. It was definitely part of the first wave, but I think this might have been the first CD, was Dokken's Back for the Attack. And it was back when they first came out. They had the boxes, the big boxes. It was very environmentally inappropriate. It was not environmentally conscious. Those big boxes for the CDs, they were a big waste. But I think they were still trying to kind of compete with records, and the mindset that people had that it should be, if it wasn't a big box, maybe it wasn't, you know, worth the money, worth the $15. I don't know. But anyway, so for the first couple of years, CDs came in these big boxes that were just a big waste of space. But I do remember that had a really cool cover. You know, the Back for the Attack cover was pretty badass. That kind of coat of arms, the Dokken Dragon coat of arms, which is cool. And I remember him playing that album a lot. So Back for the Attack was a big album I heard a lot in my formative years. He also had Under Lock and Key, which he played a lot too, and that was on cassette. So, you know, I knew Dokken was his band that, for the most part, with the exception of Under Lock and Key, had really cool album covers, and I really liked their music. It felt a little deeper, a little heavier. It was a little darker than some of the other hair metal that my brother listened to. And now I don't even consider Dokken hair metal. I know they get caught up in that, and if Under Lock and Key was like the only Dokken album you heard, I can see why you would think that they were a hair metal band, especially because of that album cover. But for the most part, I consider them what Don Dokken refers to them as melodic metal. They're a melodic metal band. They're kind of a poppier Judas Priest. That's how I think of Dokken for the most part. The classic sound is with, you know, Don Dokken when he was working with George Lynch, legendary metal guitarist George Lynch, one of the great guitar players, a guitar hero. If you're into metal and you're into guitars, you know who George Lynch is. He's in mainly because of what he did in Dokken. And, you know, he's up there for, you know, Randy Rhoads and Eddie Van Halen. To me, I mean, he might not be the innovator that Eddie Van Halen was, but he's definitely had his level of chops and expertise, and he's an amazing guitar player, and he definitely added to the Dokken sound and was one of the things that gave them their metallic edge. Otherwise, we probably would have been on the poppier side. Like, essentially, Don was kind of like the poppier melodic guy and more hard rock, and George Lynch was the more metal guy, like to shred and do jagged sounding guitars work, and it was a great combination. Unfortunately, they hated each other's guts. And this was also a big part of Dokken, is that Don Dokken, George Lynch divide. Like, the same thing that makes them great complementary collaborators is unfortunately also one of the things that makes them hate each other, because they got different musical sensibilities, and they're just like fire and ice. That's what they say. I think George Lynch is the fire and Don Dokken's the ice. And Jeff Pilson was kind of like Derek Smalls. He was the lukewarm water that kind of kept them together for a few years. And he was a very talented guy. He still is, Jeff Pilson, the bassist and multi-instrumentalist. He could play guitar, and he did great backing vocals. But, you know, ultimately, Dokken is about Don Dokken and George Lynch. And it was a great collaboration that burned very brightly, but perhaps too fiercely. And then it was all over within a few years, because they just hate each other. Like, you're lucky to get them in a studio at all. Well, actually, they won't even record in a studio. I found out they wouldn't even record in a studio back on Tooth and Nail. Going back to Tooth and Nail, that far back, George had to come in with Jeff and Mick, and then Don had to come in with, like, you know, Jeff and Mick, and they had to record the parts separately because they were hating each other even back then, which is, it's kind of sad in a way. In a way, Dokken is a sad band because they never really had fun. So it's like too bad. Like, you know, even in the 80s, they weren't really having fun. They were just fighting a lot. But that also maybe gives a little more substance to their music, because, you know, Dokken's, unlike a lot of those 80s bands from LA, they're not really a party band. They have a few rockers here and there that are kind of fun. But for the most part, I think one of the distinguishing things about Dokken is that they're moody, which I really like. They have this moody quality, and they're kind of gloomy. It gives them a little more substance than some of those other hair metal bands, especially that time period. And I just like, you know, they're moody, melodic metal, and a lot of their music sounds like the end of a cool 80s movie. Anyway, so let's get into it. I'm going to talk about their early years, the Back in the Streets EP. I will talk about that later when I talk about the Lost Tapes. So let's just jump right to Breaking the Chains. Breaking the Chains, which, this is a complicated history with this album. Okay, so Don Dokken formed an early version of Dokken with a different lineup, and they toured Europe for a little bit in Germany, and then he came back to LA. And he was kind of bouncing between Germany, and most people think that's a little odd. Like, why was he going to Germany so much in Europe? Well, as Don himself says, with the exception of Van Halen, there wasn't much of a LA metal scene. It wasn't really taking off the way it would start to take off in the mid 80s, especially after Motley Crue started to get really popular. But in the very early 80s, metal thing, it was more of a European thing, like the new wave of British heavy metal, and there was these bands in Germany which he liked, like Accept and Scorpions, that were popular. And overall, metal had not gotten that mainstream yet. It was still, there were a few big albums here and there, but it was definitely more popular in Europe than it was in America. And definitely in the LA scene, he said it was more like new wave and stuff, new wave and punk, and there was more of a receptive audience for the kind of music he liked, which he loved bands like the Scorpions, and he loved Accept, and he loved Judas Priest, and he also loved going back to like British Invasion stuff, stuff like the Beatles and the Stones. So he was always kind of drawn to Europe, and I feel like Don Dokken does have European sensibilities, and it's one of the reasons why I do think they never got quite as popular in America as I think they should have, because of that European sensibility at times. It's one of the things I said, they have a kind of gloominess to their music, which is itself a little European in nature. So even though he's an American guy, for whatever reason, Don has he has a gloomy European soul. So it's not surprising that it drew him to Germany. And so eventually he gets a lineup put together for a solo album, Don Dokken's Breaking the Chains. He gets the drummer. He gets this is the lineup that would become Dokken, the band Dokken, but with a different bassist. It was George Lynch on lead guitar, Wild and Mick Brown on drums, and Rat fans, go easy on me. I know he's Rat's bassist. If I'm mispronouncing his name, I apologize, but it's Juan Crocier. I think it's Juan Crocier. That's how it looks like it's spelled. But he's great. Let me say something about it. I do nothing against Jeff Pilson, and I understand the things he brought to the band, not just his diplomatic personality, but also his musicianship, and great backing vocals, and he was a talented songwriter who helped co-write a lot of Dokken's best songs. But that being said, I saw this clip from the early 80s of them performing in Germany. They do like an hour concert. You should watch it on YouTube. It's awesome. And I gotta say, God, this Juan Crocier guy, he kicked ass. Like I don't know. I have Rat's first two albums, and I do like him. And I love that first EP of theirs. I have that on vinyl. That's great. But I'm not a big Rat fan, so I don't know too much about, like, so I guess my question is, did this Juan guy kick so much ass in Rat? Because he really kicked ass in Dokken. He does this really badass bass solo, and he's doing some decent backing vocals too. And he's really talented, but the whole band was talented. George Lynch is cool. He's got like short hair. He looks kind of new wavy, and he's got a bandana, and he's just really raw, and they sound great. They open with Paris is Burning. It kicks ass in this clip. And Don Dokken is playing rhythm guitar. He actually does some leads too, and he's playing guitar. And I gotta say, I as much as I love their mid to late 80s albums, as you're gonna find out, I kind of like this raw incarnation where there's two guitars and they're heavier sounding, and they feel a little more legit. In this version, you would never call a hair metal band. In fact, if anything, they seem kind of ahead of the curve, not behind it. They feel like, Don Dokken's wearing this like striped shirt, looks like something Kurt Cobain would wear, and with the guitar, and he's very earnest when he's like singing these gloomy rockin' songs, that I feel like they were almost like a proto-alternative rock band back in the early 80s, which is weird, and which is ironic considering that they had a problem transitioning in the 90s. And I feel like this band wouldn't have had a problem transitioning to the 90s, but the band that they eventually became in the mid and late 80s, that band had a problem transitioning. But this early band on this German show was like ahead of the curve, man. They sounded great, and it's too bad that Don, at least for a period there, with their best albums, I guess I'll say, they were their best albums, but it's kind of sad that George Lynch, apparently George Lynch told him to stop playing rhythm guitar. He wanted him to focus on singing, and George just wanted to focus on the guitar playing, put more spotlight on him as like the main axeman. Plus, that was a little more typical of the 80s. That was an emerging thing, especially with the LA bands, the glam bands, that you had just a frontman singer, and then you had your lead guitarist, like the Van Halen model. And I feel like George Lynch was pushing them to be. He's a little more of a trendy guy than Don Dokken, as we'll discover going into the 90s too. So he wanted them, and he was also the one that pushed them to have the big hair and kind of change their look to look more glam. And it's funny because they had a Metallica's management company. It was a huge management company, also did Def Leppard. And their management company told them, hey guys, like in the mid 80s, like during Under Lock and Key, they're like, don't, just look more like yourself, wear jeans and have your hair straight, and don't like try to look like all these other bands. But George Lynch, it was going, no, we got to look hip. We got to look like the other guys, like the other bands. That's what kids are into. And as a result, I think that's one of the reasons they have that kind of stigma as being kind of a hair band. Whereas I feel if they looked more like they did in the early 80s, I don't think they would have been thought of that way. And I think they kind of would have rolled more in with like Metallica and Judas Priest as a band that could kind of adapt with the time, just be thought of as more of a straight up metal band. But hey, sometimes there's a price to pay for getting trendy, as we'll see. But anyway, so that digression aside, I will just say one last thing. Watch that video. Dokken in Germany, early 80s. Kicks ass. There's such energy. The songs, with the exception of a couple of the songs, Breaking the Chains and Paris is Burning, which are classics, the songs on the first album aren't as strong as they will get. And that is credit to Jeff Pilson and George Lynch, who take on a role in the songwriting. Jeff Pilson's not even on this album, and George Lynch isn't writing songs with Don yet. So Don Dokken kind of laid down the rhythm guitar lines, and he wrote most of the stuff. And it was his band. And at first, there's even pressings. There are European pressings of this original European mix, which is much rawer. It's a really raw mix. And it's called Don Dokken, Breaking the Chains. And it has an album cover there. I'll show it to you. There you go. Don tied up in the chains, kind of like the subsequent video they would make a few years later. It's on YouTube. You can listen to the album on YouTube. And let me tell you, it smokes. I love it. I love this version of the album. I wish they would release it in the States, like as maybe a deluxe Breaking the Chains with both versions. But this original version smokes. It's almost a new wave of British heavy metal, even though it's not British and it's an American band in Germany, but it has that power, and it's raw, and I love it. And it's like, man, I wish. It also has a studio version of Paris is Burning, which at the time they just called Paris, and it smokes, and it's great, and it has this really nice jagged sound to it. And I really love that version. I wish it was available in the States. The only way you can listen to it here is on the YouTube. If anyone wants to send me a bootleg of it, though, if it's good quality, I will accept it. Now, the Breaking the Chains that we all know in the States, and the one that eventually became like the official Breaking the Chains, essentially it's a remix, but they also did re-record some of the parts. They re-recorded, George Lynch re-recorded some of his leads, and Don re-recorded his vocals, and both the guitar playing and singing is a little bit better in spots because of that. They have grown, but that mix it's kind of stilted, and it's not as rockin', and it's a little too clean, and the guitars don't sound loud enough, and it's just a little light, and it doesn't have the same punch. For years, even when I was younger, I remember thinking that I didn't think this album was too good. Not as nearly as good as the next album, or even the two after that. I just thought that this was definitely the weakest of their 80s albums. And I guess I still think that. But I gotta say, listening to it for the past couple of weeks, I kind of got into it, and I was thinking, I've always been hard on this album. In fact, I'd still say it's their weakest 80s album, but with the exception of only one other album after the 80s, this is, I'd say this is my fifth favorite Dokken album now. It's really grown on me. The guitars aren't as loud as they should be. It's not as punchy in the production, but still the songs are not that bad. I actually like them a lot. Hey, you've got Breaking the Chains. That's a classic. That song kicks ass, and that has some very great George Lynch riffage going on there, and it's just a great tune. In the Middle, I love that song. That's a really good, moody, mid-tempo, dark hard rock song. I love Felony. Felony, there's an original version that's Back in the Streets, which is pretty cool and heavy. But this version I really love. It's kind of funky. It's kind of almost like mid-70s Aerosmith. There's something really kind of funky about it. And I love that chorus and the way the guitars sound when they hit the chords and they go, felony, felony. Really got into that. Can't See You is kind of a power pop song. That's catchy. Night Rider's cool. Seven Thunders is a heavy song, especially the original mix. But even in this mix, it's still pretty good. Stick to Your Guns. Whoa, just like Motley Crue on their first album, the original, although that was only in the original pressing of the Motley Crue's first album. They have a song called Stick to Your Guns. Different songs. I like both songs, though. They both kick ass. In fact, I think this one's even better. I love Dokken Stick to Your Guns. And man, this song cooked live, too. But yeah, that's a great song. And then, of course, it ends with Paris is Burning, live in Berlin, December 1982. Paris is Burning, wow. And I could see, even though I did like that old studio version, I could see why they went with this live version. It smokes. You know, George Lynch does a little guitar solo in the beginning, and man, it kicks ass and it's heavy. And it's people that say, oh, Dokken, they're just like a hair metal band or they're not real metal. Let me tell you something. Hey, I don't care about labels, but if you do care about labels, pop in Paris is Burning and tell me that's not metal. Come on, it doesn't get more metal than that. That's like Judas Priest shit. It's fucking awesome. Love Paris is Burning. One of them easily top 5 Dokken song for me. And that live version just smokes. And this is a really good album. I wouldn't say great, but it's a really good album and it's grown a lot on me. And I was surprised how much this album has grown on me. Maybe it's also because I've acquired a little more of a taste over the years for the new wave of British heavy metal and power pop. I've been listening a lot of Cheap Trick and the Cars and a lot of bands I didn't listen to so much when I was younger. So I think listening to that stuff has made me appreciate this album more. It's just a good, catchy, hard rock, at times metal album, and I really like it a lot. Then we get to 1984, Tooth and Nail. Okay, Tooth and Nail. I'm going to do some major gushing right now. Tooth and Nail, in my opinion, is not only the greatest Dokken album, like scientifically, it's both objectively and subjectively their best album, in my opinion. And a lot of people, actually, I think most people say that Tooth and Nail is their best album. It's a masterpiece. That's right, a masterpiece. In fact, I'm going to go as far to say I feel that it's easily one of the best metal albums of the 80s. In fact, I think it's better than some albums, which even though I think are great albums, I think they're a little overhyped. Like one, okay, just be prepared. This might shock you, but I think Tooth and Nail is better than Appetite for Destruction. So there. I love Appetite for Destruction. It's like really played out for me. I'm not really interested in listening to that album ever again. Like maybe It's So Easy and Night Train sometimes, but for the most part, that album's really played out for me. And it's great. But Tooth and Nail, I've listened to probably twice as many times as Appetite for Destruction. And it's still not played out for me. There's something magical about this album. And every song on it's great. There's no Anything Goes on this album, you know. Everything is great on this album. It's tight, it's focused. Even though I love this album, I think it's better than Motley Crue's Shout of the Devil. And that's a close one. That album's really great. But I think Tooth and Nail is even better than that. I mean, short of some of the British new wave of heavy metal acts and Judas Priest, Van Halen, AC/DC, Metallica, Megadeth. Okay, short of like some of the stuff they were doing, which I think is a little bit better. But if we're talking like hair metal bands, there's nothing that comes even close to Tooth and Nail. Nothing. Yeah, maybe early, if you want to count early Def Leppard, like High and Dry. I think High and Dry is definitely gives Tooth and Nail a run for its money. It might be a little bit better. I might give High and Dry and maybe even Pyromania. But Tooth and Nail comes very close. Tooth and Nail is one of the best metal albums ever, in my opinion. And, you know, if someone is wondering, should they get into Dokken? Well, this is the album to listen to. Listen to Tooth and Nail. And this is the first one that featured Jeff Pilson on bass and doing backing vocals. And he helped to kind of beef up the sound a little bit melodically. He had some good backing vocals. And the band started writing together. And already, like I said, George and Don hated each other. So they all kind of, Jeff had to write separately with George and Don. And, you know, and sometimes Mick Brown also contributed to the songwriting. And so they all kind of put in, they all were working together here. So they really were a band. Even though they started off as a Don Dokken solo project, by this album, Tooth and Nail, this is a band now, a band working together. Even if sometimes they can't be in the same room together, they are working together for this end goal. And the album they put together, man, let's just go through the tracks. First, it opens up with that little haunting guitar instrumental, Without Warning, which I love, totally sets the mood. Kicks into Tooth and Nail. Whoa. Another song like Paris is Burning. If you want, someone says, hey, Dokken's not metal, play them Tooth and Nail, and then say, tell me to my face that that's not metal. It doesn't get more metal than Tooth and Nail. And I'd say this is my favorite George Lynch guitar solo. Oh man, it's amazing. Just Got Lucky. Woo! Really catchy song. This is something that Pilson and Lynch wrote together. Really catchy. Really catchy. It's funny. And that just shows, Don Dokken, even though he was the melodic guy and he was the guy that liked poppier stuff, here's Lynch and Pilson knocking out one of their catchiest songs ever. I have a theory. I'll talk about why I think Dokken wasn't quite as big as I think they should have been. And they were a fairly big band in the late 80s, but not quite to the same degree as Motley Crue and Def Leppard and some of these other bands. And I think there's a few reasons for that, which I will discuss. Besides, there are sometimes European sensibilities, even though they were Americans. But Just Got Lucky, that song's so catchy. Why wasn't that a bigger hit? And Heartless Heart, ooh, love Heartless Heart. It's got the gang vocals, sounds tough, it's jiving, catchy stuff. Don't Close Your Eyes, one of my favorite songs on the album. Man, it's really fast and both heavy and catchy and melodic all at the same time. And that's the thing that's very impressive with Dokken, is that and Priest did this sometimes too, where they can be very heavy and melodic at the same time. And Don't Close Your Eyes is a great example of that. When Heaven Comes Down, heavy. Now this is a slow, almost kind of doomy song. I love this. When Heaven Comes Down is really, talk about metal. And it just, when Heaven Comes Down, that just sounds metal. Into the Fire, my favorite Dokken song. I used to think it was this other song, which we'll talk about, which is probably my second favorite. I finally succumbed to this a few years ago. I was like, nah, it's Into the Fire. I'm just kidding myself. Why would I act like Into the Fire is not my favorite Dokken song? It is. It's one of my favorite songs, period. It's majestic. I've used that word a lot in some of my reviews. And Dokken is very majestic. With the way the guitar comes in, the acoustic guitar, and I like a little bit of synth in the background, not overdone, just the right amount to create some mood. Don comes in with this pageantry. Let's talk about Don Dokken. And let's talk about his vocals, because this is another contention with metal fans, especially the ones that are into the heavier side of metal. There's like, yeah, I like George Lynch, his guitar playing, and the music's cool, but what's up with this Don Dokken clown? Like, he sings in this light, wussy way. That's kind of the criticism, that Don Dokken has a wussy voice. And let's put it this way. Yes, if you only listen to metal and you just want to hear growly kind of singers and screamy singers, or those kind of singers, or banshee vocals and all those kind of singing, if that's the only kind of singing you want, yes, then Don Dokken is going to be spoiling this otherwise cool metal music for you. He's going to be the fly in your ointment. But if you do listen to a lot of other kinds of music and hard rock and power pop, and you love, for example, the Beatles and like Paul McCartney, then that's not going to be a sticking point for you. And it's not a sticking point for me. As some of you might know, I'm a huge Paul McCartney fan. And I love not just the Beatles, but Wings. Big Wings fan. And I feel that Don Dokken is too. I know he likes the Beatles. I hear a McCartney-esque quality to his vocals, especially when he does the softer parts, but in the poppier stuff. But overall, I hear like, it sounds like that was one of the singers he was trying to emulate. I would say bittersweet quality, a wistfulness to his voice. It adds a depth to this kind of music. You're not used to hearing a singer sing metal this way. It's different. And that's one of the things I think gives Dokken a little color and a little nuance. It makes them a little different and stand out. And, it's one thing I like. I always said the same thing about Anthrax with Joey Belladonna. A lot of people didn't think Joey Belladonna sounded tough enough, and he was too much, almost sounded like Steve Perry-esque at times, and they didn't like that. But hey, I love Steve Perry and I love Joey Belladonna, and I thought that was, again, something that made Anthrax a little different from the other thrash bands. So the fact that Don Dokken sings more like a melodic hard rock or pop guy, pop rock guy, is one of the things that makes Dokken sound a little different. And it's that combination of him with George Lynch's badass guitar playing, it just creates this quality. I will say, especially when his vocals were at the strongest, which is starting from here, I'd say from here into the mid-90s. So he had a good 10-year period there where his singing was really good, in my opinion. And, you know, he could do a scream here and there. He could throw in a metal scream when he needed to. And he hits this great note at the end of Tooth and Nail. So he could do a little bit of that Rob Halford stuff. Not to the same degree as the metal god, but who can? Most mere mortals can't. And there's something, like I said, like they're not really a party band. Like they're kind of gloomy sounding. If anything, they're kind of proto-emo. But the Don Dokken's Into the Fire, for example, that's where there's something majestic. Like he comes in and he starts singing, you know, and there's just a power to it. There's pathos. That's what I'm saying. There's more pathos to Don Dokken's voice than you heard in a lot of metal bands at that time period. And it's something that gives their music a little bit of character and a little bit of depth. And it's also in the musicianship. I think overall, especially if we're comparing them to hair metal bands, which again, I don't really think of them as a hair metal band. But if we're comparing them to those kind of bands, for the most part, their music had a lot more depth and a lot more character. I think they were more of a class act. And musically, they could just do more things. To me, they weren't on quite a level as Priest, and Priest is one of the greatest bands ever. So that's not a slight against Dokken that they're not as great as Judas Priest. But although Judas Priest has done albums not as good as Tooth and Nail. So it's like, you know, Tooth and Nail is definitely a lot better than like Turbo, for example. But I will say that Dokken was closer to Priest in the sense that their musicianship and their songwriting and their overall skills and their unique quality made them closer to that band than a lot of their other contemporaries, in my opinion. And Into the Fire is a great example of this. It's just got a little more depth and a little more power than I feel a lot of their contemporaries could have pulled off with a song like that. And unless you went heavier, like went to like Metallica with like Fade to Black or something like that, in which case, you know, yeah, that's, you know, perhaps on yet another level. But this level is still pretty damn good, and I love it. You got Bullets to Spare. That's great. Another thing, like this song's really rocking, but then it has this little middle part that suddenly sounds like Into the Fire, and that's really cool. Alone Again, the ballad, I think along with Home Sweet Home, Motley Crue, this was one of the songs that kind of popularized the idea that a metal band should have a ballad. That's like kind of the crossover song with that the girls alike. But this is a beautiful song. Alone Again, it's a mood. It doesn't feel like a ballad just written for money, you know? It's not sweet. It's dark. There's a darkness to it, and there's mood and atmosphere and real pathos. And Don's one of his best singing performances. It's really great. And then Turn On the Action, that's like one of the few songs that's kind of a fun song. That's just like a fun rocking song, and it kicks ass. But yeah, every song on this is perfect. It's a perfect album. Flawless from first note to last note. One of the great metal albums ever, 80s or otherwise. So get with it. Buy it. It's awesome. And then we get to 1985, Under Lock and Key. Now, Under Lock and Key, as you can see from the album cover, this is definitely them getting a little poppier and a little more into, this is the closest I would say they are to being a hair metal band, because this was very fashionable at the time and they decided to jump into that. And, you know, it's a little like, it's not as bad as like Kiss with Asylum, although I love that album Asylum. I'm not talking about the music, I'm talking about the image. But in terms of the image, they're kind of doing that. It's very 80s. It's very colorful. They're wearing like colorful outfits there, you know, primary colors and stuff. And it's a horrible album cover. I so wish this album had a different album cover. And I think it's a little like Cinderella's Night Songs. Although this is even worse, because at least that's like nighttime. But I guess this is nighttime. I don't know. It's hard to say. They're inside some space, some studio space. But it's something that looks really corny and makes the music look fluffier than it is. And yes, this is a slicker album than Tooth and Nail, and it's not as great, I'm not going to say, but it is great, just not as great as Tooth and Nail. And I'd say this is their third best album. I do love this record. There was a time where I was thinking, it's a little too slick for me, and it's not as good as the album before or the album after it, but I've grown, and even though I do agree with that, I do think the one before and after it are better. It's still great. It's still part of what I would call the holy trinity of Dokken, you know. And obviously it's got some of their biggest hits, and some of which I'm surprised weren't even bigger than they were. And it's definitely a more melodic, less, it's not as heavy. There are like 2 songs that are kind of heavy, but for the most part, this is the melodic side. But again, the songwriting, God, in the mid 80s, hey, I like Motley Crue, but Motley Crue could not put together, they were lucky if they had like 2 or 3 good songs by this period. By the mid 80s, like Girls, Girls, Girls and Theater of Pain, in my opinion, have a lot of filler. A lot of filler. I also think the Rat albums from this period, after the first album, have a lot of filler. There are a lot of bands from this period, the albums had a lot of filler. Dokken, no filler. It's all killer. There's only 1 song on this album that I think is fillerish. But that's it, 1 song. Unchained the Night opened up again, majestic, the atmosphere, and then it kicks into this cool down and dirty riff. Love it. Catchy song, really good lyrics, kind of Dio-esque. Really love it. Then you got the second song, The Hunter. The Hunter is the song that I used to think was my favorite Dokken song until I realized, nah, it's Into the Fire. But The Hunter is probably my second favorite Dokken song. It is so catchy. It just comes in. It's just kind of a, I guess, mid-tempo hard rock song, but man, is it catchy. Those guitar lines and the melody, and it's got swagger to it, but moody swagger, that great Dokken moody, gloomy swagger. You know, it's kind of feels like it should be a scene in a movie where someone's like a detective or someone is going through the streets, you know, looking for someone, you know, and it's but sexy and it's got atmosphere, and I love The Hunter. In My Dreams, probably the most popular song on the album, and it was a modest hit in the mid 80s. It was a modest hit. But really, you listen to this song, you go, why the hell was it just a modest hit? Why wasn't this like in the top 10, like pop charts? I'm not talking about rock charts, because this is a pop masterpiece, a little pop rock masterpiece. I mean, I had this idea, I had this inflated idea, that this song was a bigger hit than it was, because my brother played it all the time. And him and his buddy one day spent all day calling up MTV to get it on, what was it called? It was like Total Request or something, I think. Total Request Live. I forget the name of the show. That might have been it. If you know, tell me in the comments section. But it was the show on MTV where you called and requested a song, and then they would do like the top 10 requested songs. The VJ would put it on. And they were proud that my brother spent one whole day with his buddy calling them nonstop again and again and again, and kept requesting In My Dreams. And it broke into the top 10. And he was like, so this is a story that he still recounts with pride. This glorious moment that he got In My Dreams, it got into the MTV top 10 because of his efforts. And it was a modest hit. But still, not as big as I feel this song should have been, because this song is really, really, really catchy. It's ear candy. It's ear candy. It's not even one of my favorite songs on the album, but objectively, I hear this and go, this is like a pop hit. But I also think Just Got Lucky should have been a bigger hit than it was too, but especially this one. Slipping Away. They didn't even release this as a single. I almost sometimes feel this is another issue with Dokken. Now I'm going to talk about why I think Dokken wasn't as big as I think they should have been. I think they needed to release more singles, especially more singles from this album and Back for the Attack, because they have all these catchy songs and they only release a couple of them. Slipping Away is like this album's alone again. Why aren't they releasing it? It's this really beautiful, haunting, but yet very catchy ballad. Why even record a song like Slipping Away if you're not going to release it? You know, it's like really catchy, and it's not even a single. They never made a video for it or released it. So I don't know. Sometimes I felt like Dokken was not, or the record company or whatever, was not releasing what they always should have been releasing. Another problem with Dokken, I felt, is for the most part, their videos weren't that good. And this was a period in the 80s where having really good videos did help a song and help an album, you know, move a lot of units. And like in this regard, they could not compete with Motley Crue. I mean, not only were the guys in Motley Crue, for the most part, arguably better looking guys, with the exception of Mick Mars, of course, but the videos were much better. Their videos were really slick and high concept and looked like little movies, kind of like Duran Duran, you know? And Def Leppard also had really great slick looking videos. And a lot of these bands, Rat had better videos than Dokken. Dokken had the worst videos. There's one, It's Not Love, I think had a decent video where they're playing on the flat bed truck and the whole crowd singing along with him. And he's got the cool skeleton, skull and crossbones skeleton guitar, and that had cool visuals. But still, it's pretty much a basic performance video, but that's probably their best looking video. That and, well, another one, but that's a movie tie-in, so we'll talk about that afterwards. For the most part, their video is really corny. I mean, I love the Breaking the Chains video, but it's corny. It's silly. Like, and that's the thing. And most of their videos, even In My Dreams, is probably one of the better ones, but still kind of corny, especially when you compare it to what the Motley Crue videos look like. So I feel like if Dokken had better videos and were a little more aggressive with how they released their singles, I feel like Dokken could have maybe gotten to an even bigger level. I mean, they were headlining arenas by the late 80s, so it wasn't, and they were making a lot of money, so it wasn't like, don't cry for Dokken. But I just feel like they could have been an even bigger band because they had the songs, they had the goods, and these songs are really catchy, and sometimes they don't, like Slipping Away, they didn't even bother releasing them as a single. So you just sometimes, it's like, what's going on, Dokken? Come on, let's do it. Let's do it. You got these catchy-ass songs. Let's sell them, you know, and make the best video possible to really sell them. You know, In My Dreams should have had like a Duran Duran level kind of production to that song, to me, that video. It should have been epic and cinematic, and that would have pushed the song even farther. Anyway, Lightning Strikes Again, great kick-ass, heavy song. This is one of the heavier songs on the album, but still melodic, kind of like Don't Close Your Eyes. You know, it's heavy, but melodic at the same time. It's not love. Catchy, kind of AC/DC-ish, you know, has the cool finger tapping, George Lynch guitar riff, and sing-along chorus. Jaded Heart, such a catchy song, such a catchy song. This could have been a single, too. It's really catchy, and it's good mid-tempo, moody Dokken song. Don't Lie to Me, that's the one song that I think is filler. That song's just, It's not bad, but it's not up to par with the other songs. So I feel like that's the one thing, the one song that holds it back a bit. But that's it, one song. And it's not horrible, it's just Will the Sun Rise? Probably my second favorite song on the album. I love this. And this also, I think, should have had a video and this should have been at the end credits of some movie. This is an amazing song. Amazing, majestic, catchy, atmosphere, mood, pageantry, all the things I love about a Dokken song are in Will the Sun Rise. And then it has a good rockin' heavy song at the end, Till the Living End, kicks ass. Just kicks ass rocker. Great way to end this album. If this is indeed the Dokken hair metal album, it owns all other hair metal albums from that period because it is so catchy, and Dokken is a goddamn class act. But I still wish the production was not quite as slick, and I wish that there was some heavier stuff on it to counterbalance the poppier stuff. And you know what? They do exactly that on the next album. But before we get to that next album, we got to talk about Dream Warriors. Yes, Dream Warriors. Probably the song that Dokken is most known for, which is probably both a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. It's a good song. I like it. Don't get me wrong. Dream Warriors, it's a real fun song. I always listen to it around Halloween time. And I'm a big Nightmare on Elm Street fan. So, nothing against Dream Warriors. My brother, actually, before Back for the Attack, I remember he had the cassette single for this. And it had Back for the Attack, the song, as a B-side, which is actually not on the album Back for the Attack. So go figure. And well, we'll talk more about that and what I think about, you know, what songs should or should not have maybe made the cut for Back for the Attack. But this was a great B-side. Love that song. Also had it also had Paris is Burning, the live version of that too. But, you know, so that was just kind of a waste because, you know, you already had it on Breaking the Chains. I think it was the same exact version. But anyway, Dream Warriors, it was a really catchy song, and I heard the song before I saw the movie. I was a little too young to go see the Nightmare on Elm Street movies at the time, so I saw it a couple years later on VHS, and I love it. I'm a huge Nightmare on Elm Street fan. I'm going to do something real quick that I also did with Friday the 13th, where on the Alice Cooper, on my part 2 of my Alice Cooper discography review, when I got to The Man Behind the Mask, I gave a quick breakdown of how I felt about the Friday the 13th movies. So I'm going to do it with Nightmare on Elm Street. Right now, here we go. Okay, my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie is 2, Freddy's Revenge. How could that be my favorite Freddy movie? It just is. It's cool, it's gritty, it's pervy, it's a very interesting movie. I love that it's this weird standalone film, and Freddy's still kind of grimy and mean, and I love that movie. It's great. It's awesome. And there's then 4, Dream Master is actually my second favorite. and that's great. It's a really slick looking movie. It looks great. You get a lot of fun Freddy moments. It's kind of the flip side. If 2 is real dark and grimy, this is real slick and entertaining. And it's Robert Englund at his like Bela Lugosi best. He's really fun and entertaining, and I love the character of Alice. I think is a stronger character than Nancy. So there you go. I think she has a better arc. I like her and her drunk father and her daydreaming and all that stuff. I think it's good stuff. And it has my favorite kill scene too, the one involving the waterbed. I love that scene. It's great. How's this for a wet dream? And then the original. I'd say the original, which is a masterpiece, and of course one of the most inventive and imaginative horror movies ever made. And that's a great movie. And Freddy's still creepy and scary in that. Like when he's got the big long arms, that's cool. So that's my third favorite. Used to be my favorite when I was younger. I'd say that and the third. But over the years, 2 and 4 have kind of shot up. Fourth favorite would be 3, Dream Warriors. Very entertaining film. Love it. It's a little more of a horror fantasy adventure, which is probably why I like those other 3 better, because they're all more like horror movies, and probably why as I've gotten older, I don't like it quite as much as I did when I was younger, because when I was younger, I was more into like adventure and action and not quite as into horror. I've developed more of a taste for horror and darker stuff as I gotten older, but still a great film. Love Dream Warriors. The first 4, you can't go wrong with the first 4 Nightmare on Elm Street movies, in my opinion, no matter how you put them. Then I'd say Freddy vs. Jason, which had some cool stuff. I like the fight scene at the end. And then 5 started off good, very promising actually. The first 10 minutes of 5, Dream Child. The whole birth of Freddy thing, it's a boy, that's cool. And I like the idea, the basic concept of Alice and her kid, you know, the baby, Freddy coming through that. It's a great concept. But then the movie gets really bad. And the side kids, like her friends in the movie, are really annoying. And Freddy gets just way too cartoonish. And it loses the plot. But not as bad as the worst one of the original series, which is 6. Don't like that at all. Freddy's Dead, that's really lame. Really lame, and it feels like a 90s horror movie, which was not a great period for horror movies, in my opinion. New Nightmare was all right, though. I like New Nightmare better than 5 and 6. Still not as good as the first 4, but it was clever. It was doing that before Scream was doing the postmodern thing. That was good. And I did not care for the remake from Platinum Dunes, which is interesting because I did love the remake, or more of a reboot, actually, of Friday the 13th. I really liked the Platinum Dunes Friday the 13th, but I did not care for the Nightmare on Elm Street they did. I did not think that was very good. Only saw it once, though. But those first 4 movies kick ass. So anyway, so that's my little mini Nightmare on Elm Street filmography review. Now let's get back to Dokken. So Dokken does Dream Warriors. Everyone loves Dream Warriors. It's, not, at least in the metal community, it's like a modest hit. And it will be included on this album. The album that I said was the first CD, I believe, that my brother ever bought. I'll have to ask him about that later, but it was definitely in the first wave. 1987's Back for the Attack. Back for the Attack. Oh, man, look. Cool album title and awesome album cover. Look at that album cover. The dragon coat of arms. I love it. The Rainbow Bar and Grill in L.A. has the platinum record of this by the Inside Bar, the downstairs Inside Bar, which is close to where they have the Ms. Pac-Man machine and stuff. I don't know if you've ever been there. But anyway, so I always used to like to sit. I sat all over that goddamn bar, but outside bar. And so actually, I probably like the outside bar the best, which is where Lemmy used to hang out. But anyway, the inside bar is cool, and sometimes I'd go there if the outside bar was too crowded to sit at. But anyway, you would sit there, and I'd always turn my head, and I'd see the platinum record for Back for the Attack, and it was just a cool thing to look at while you're having a drink, while you're having a whiskey, and you turn and you see Back for the Attack. Ah, man, I miss the Rainbow. I haven't been there. This whole pandemic thing's been going on. I've been stuck in Florida for the past 5 months, so looking forward to when this is all done, I can go back and hang out at the Rainbow again. Anyway, that digression aside, Back for the Attack, what do I think? You already know that I think it's better than Under Lock and Key, and it's easily my second favorite Dokken album. Not quite as great as Tooth and Nail. It's not the perfect album that is, but it's damn close. It's almost perfect. And I like this one better than Appetite for Destruction, too. I'd say it's about on par Shadow of the Devil. Anyway, but it's still one of the best metal albums ever. I love this. And man, George Lynch's guitar tone, he's the hero of this album. I mean, it's a team effort, but if Tooth and Nail, it's like everyone coming together and make a great album. This is George Lynch going kind of that one extra mile to really push things. In some ways, I feel like Under Lock and Key is more of the Don album, and this is more the George album. You know, it's kind of like the Rolling Stones. Some albums are more Mick, some are more Keith. You know, and this feels more like a George Lynch album. I mean, there's not even a ballad on this. I mean, there's one song that's kind of a ballad. It's pretty much all just hard rock and heavy metal. It's really straight up heavy. And right out of the gate with Kiss of Death, whoa, George Lynch's guitar tone. And I read that he spent a lot of time getting just the guitar tone right. Probably drove Don crazy. But man, it was worth it because this guitar sound, he does the pinch harmonics, you know, with Zakk Wylde would do a lot, and Dimebag would do it as well. And George is doing that shit here in 1987. He's doing it, and it's amazing. And it's yet still got this jagged sound to it. The production's beefier, much beefier than Under Lock and Key. And this is much heavier right out of the gate. Kiss of Death's heavy. This is another song that if people say Dokken's not metal, throw Kiss of Death in their face. Say, there you go, metal. Kiss of Death doesn't get more metal than that, my friend. And then the second song, Prisoner. Woo! My favorite song on the album. Very catchy. And yet, this was not the lead-off single for the album. It totally should have been. This is the album's Hunter. And I don't even, it's like even in the same position, the second track. And they didn't release it. And it's so catchy. Why didn't they release this? They should have been a video with sexy ladies hitting the band with chains and, you know, shot really well. Cinematic. Anyway, I don't get why Dokken did. They only released two. I'm not counting Dream Warriors, by the way, because that was out months before this came out. If you don't count Dream Warriors, there was only 2 songs that had videos from this album, and it's their biggest album. This was a big hit. You know, coming off after Under Lock and Key and Dream Warriors, Dokken's fan base had grown, and this is the peak of their career, and this was their biggest selling album. Man, there are so many catchy songs on this album, and they only released 2 songs from it. So I don't know. It's sometimes I feel like Dokken tried hard, and sometimes they didn't try hard. But anyway, Prisoner's a great song. I love it. Really catchy. That guitar line in the beginning, and the effects, and there's so much going on with George Lynch's guitar playing, while at the same time always servicing the song. Kind of like Jimmy Page that way. Like, he's doing a lot of cool stuff, but never stuff that's not part of what the fabric of the song should be. Night by Night, really catchy, kind of AC/DC-ish sounding song, real catchy chorus. Love the gang vocals. It's now or never, get out of the way. Love it. And then that chorus, hey, that should have been released. Why wasn't that a video and single? Very damn catchy. Standing in the Shadows. Probably my second favorite song. Yeah, this is my second favorite song on the album. So catchy. Another song I think they should have released as a single and had a video for. That guitar playing, it's a little like the finger tapping AC/DC-ish kind of thing that George Lynch did on It's Not Love, but it's even better. Like, it's got this cool effect, and the production's flawless, and Don's great. He's got the pageantry going on. It's that gloomy, suave thing going on, and Standing in the Shadows. Man, watching the world go by. Love this song. Love the lyrics, the music. Perfect song. Heaven Sent. Some people call this a ballad. I don't think this is a ballad. It was the second song single released. It had a video. Not particularly great video, just kind of average. Should have been better. It's a catchy song. I do agree that it was one of the songs they should have released. But I don't really think of it as a ballad. I think of it more just a mid-tempo kind of pop rock song. It has this cool bluesy quality, which we haven't heard from Dokken at this point yet. The opening guitar riff, George's riff, it has this kind of metallic modern blues quality to it, and it's really cool. It's a little different for them. And then it kind of kicks into kind of a typical kind of mid-tempo Dokken song. But I love that riff in the intro and the verses. It sounds really great. Got Mr. Scary, the instrumental, one of George Lynch's finest moments. This whole album is his finest moment, in my opinion. But goddamn, normally instrumentals, I find them kind of boring, especially metal instrumentals. But there's a few, like Orion, Metallica. I love that. And this is up there. This is not quite as great as Orion, but it's up there. It's like, in my opinion, one of the top 5 best metal instrumentals ever. Mr. Scary. In live, this would be like the big guitar showcase. And then I say this, the second side is not quite as strong as the first side. I do think it's really good. I like it, and it's grown on me more over the years. I used to always think the second side was kind of a dip, and it is a dip, but not as bad as I used to think. I'm listening to it, and it's still pretty solid. It's just, I think one thing is, this is part of the CD age now. This is like one of the first CDs, and it's got 13 songs on it. And I feel it'd be better if it was just 12 songs. I would have lost Stop Fighting Love. I feel like that's just an all right song. It's actually better than the filler song from Under Lock and Key, but it's not as good as any other song on this album. So that's the one I would have chose to be a B-side. And I would have swapped out Dream Warriors for Back for the Attack. I feel like that, I mean, it's the title track. Title track should be on this album. And I would have kept Dream Warriors just as a single, standalone single. And Back for the Attack should have opened up the second side, and the album could have ended with Sleepless Night, which I think is a good way to end the album. So that's the only, if they had done that, then the album would have been perfect. And still maybe not as great as Tooth and Nail, but would have been even one step closer. But still pretty damn close. I love it. So Many Tears, great, catchy. Actually, this second side sounds a little more like a beefier Under Lock and Key. Like, this is a little more the Don side, the second side. Burning Like a Flame, which was the lead-off single and video, and even though I think Prisoner should have been the lead-off single, I do think this definitely should have been like the second song, although they should have had a better video. That video with them on the fire truck, it's lame. That's the thing. Like, why not have a better video for this really catchy kind of power pop song? It's really catchy, but the video's lame, so I think that took away from it. Lost Behind the Wall, I really dig this. It sounds kind of like an Accept song. You know, it's cool. It's a little dark, and it's a little political. I think it's about the Berlin Wall. But Lost Behind the Wall is great. Sounds like an Accept song, and I love Accept. I'm going to do an Accept video one of these days, too. So that's great. And I told her Stop Fighting Love's like the only song that I don't think is too hot on this. And that's like the only one that's kind of a quasi-ballad, kind of. Cry the Gypsy's cool song. Not one of the strongest songs on the album, but it's a good, decent, solid filler track. So I call this killer filler. I like Cry the Gypsy. And Sleepless Night, which is a little different for them. It actually sounds a little Van Halen-esque. This is a song that's a little more fun sounding for Dokken. And hell, I think this also could have been like a single, with a cool video with a sexy lady. They should have done that too. I don't know why there wasn't more singles released from their biggest album from 1987 during the height of the video era. I mean, God, look how many fucking videos Def Leppard released from Hysteria, So, come on, Dokken. This could have won even more platinum. I don't know if it won, how many platinums it went, but it could have won one more platinum than it did if they had released a few more singles and videos from it. But anyway, whatever. It's still a great album. I love it. Their second best album, in my opinion, and one of my favorite metal albums from the 80s. All right. So now we're going to do all the shit they did afterwards. And I'll probably shoot through these a little faster. I'll try anyway. Anyway, so Dokken breaks up because George Lynch and Don Dokken hate each other. And by this point, pretty much everyone hates Don Dokken in the band. The accusation is that he's kind of a control freak and prima donna, kind of like how the other three Beatles felt about Paul McCartney, And this is, so they kind of all sided against him, and they were like, fuck you. And Don Dokken was like, fuck you. And apparently Don and George had a fist fight. They were opening for AC/DC. And after their set, they went outside the arena or stadium, wherever they were. I don't know the exact location, but after their set, George Lynch and Don Dokken had a 10-minute long fist fight. Yeah, it's like it was like the fist fight and They Live. They had this long fist fight, and this was before George Lynch was pumping iron, so it was probably even fight. They were both kind of skinny rock guys. So it took 10 minutes, and they beat the crap out of each other. And after that, it's like, fuck you, the band's over. So right as they were hitting their commercial peak, just as they were a headline act, and they were playing the Monsters of Rock, and Dokken was getting bigger, they blew it. I'm not going to discuss side projects or Lynch Mob or anything like that, because we'd be here forever. But I am going to talk about Don Dokken's first solo album, 1990's Up From the Ashes, because this was supposed to be a Dokken album. Essentially, Don Dokken planned that he was just going to go back to what he was doing, like with Breaking the Chains, where it was his band, and he was going to get a new band around him, and that band would be called Dokken, because he is Don Dokken. So, I think this, he did start the band. As much as I love that 80s lineup and think Jeff Pilson and George Lynch and Mick Brown brought a lot to the band, as much as I think that, I do think that ultimately Don Dokken formed the band, and it's his goddamn name. He's Don Dokken. So I think he has a right to it. And same thing I said about David Coverdale. I felt for similar reasons that he had claim to the band being called Whitesnake. So I think Don Dokken had an argument, but unfortunately for him, this judge disagreed and said that he could not use the name without the other band members. So as a result, this album that he was planning on being Dokken's follow-up to Back for the Attack with the new lineup ended up being called Don Dokken. And it's very Dokken sounding. In fact, it's more Dokken sounding than a lot of later subsequent albums that have the name that are Dokken albums. So it's kind of ironic. It's really ironic too, because the next album was supposed to be a solo album, and then and it sounds different from Dokken, and that was then made into a Dokken album. Whereas this one sounds intentionally like he's trying to make a Dokken follow-up. He's forced to call it Don Dokken. So there you go. So that's some irony, folks. But anyway, so this new lineup, he's got John Norum from Europe, The Final Countdown. This is another CD my brother played a lot that I didn't really care for that much. And he also got the bassist from Accept. Remember I said Lost Behind the Wall sounded like an Accept song? Well, there you go. So, you know, he liked Accept, so that's not a surprise. And Mikkey Dee, one of my favorite drummers, who had played with King Diamond and then would more famously go on to become one of Motorhead's longest, actually he might have been in the band longer than Filthy Animal. He was in the band for a very long time up until the end, and he's the best drummer I've ever seen live, seeing him play with Motorhead. Mikkey Dee is the best drummer I've ever seen live. That guy kicks ass. He doesn't get to do that much on this album. For the most part, this album's a little more on the Under Lock and Key side. It's a little more mid-tempo hard rock. There's not a lot of faster songs for the most part, but it's a great album. In fact, I don't know. It might be better than Under Lock and Key. Maybe. I don't know. It's close. This is really good. This is a really good album. It's grown a lot of me over the years. And it's, you know, Crash and Burn's a great song. And it's still hard rocking. Actually, it's a little more hard rocking than Under Lock and Key. Maybe not as much as Tooth and Nail and Back for the Attack, but more hard rocking than Under Lock and Key. 1,000 Miles Away, which is kind of soft and poppy during the verses, but the chorus has this chorus that sounds kind of like Accept. It sounds like Accept a bit. Oh, Win Some Nights, that's a really catchy song. I really like that song. Forever is very catchy. Both these songs I think should have been singles, and they weren't released as singles. I think this album could have done a little bit better too with some better singles and videos. Mirror Mirror, which was the one song that was a single and in a video, and that's a really catchy song. It's got the finger tapping. You can tell he's trying to get the Europe guy to sound like George Lynch here, and why wouldn't you if you could play that way, if you can sound like George Lynch, go for it. And that's really catchy. Down in Flames, The Hunger, that's a good rockin' tune. This is a really solid album. If you're a Dokken fan, definitely get this. This is actually one of the most Dokken-y sounding albums you're going to get, especially from this point on. So you should definitely check out this album, and I feel like it would get more love if simply the Don was not there and it was just Dokken. You know, more people would listen to this album, and it's great. It's definitely up in the top 5 for me. And then we're going to get to the next one, 1995, Dysfunctional. Ooh, now this is the first controversial Dokken album we're going to get to. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people are just I'm in the love it category. I love this album. I think it's one of their greatest albums. Sometimes I put this ahead of Under Lock and Key and Up From the Ashes. It's not as great as, you know, Tooth and Back for the Attack. They're pretty locked in there as my top 2. It's really, really great. It's a great album. And some fans don't like it because it doesn't sound... There's a few songs here and there, one especially, which I'll talk about. But for the most part, it doesn't sound like 80s Dokken. But why should they sound like 80s Dokken? Because it's goddamn 1995. You know, it's the mid-90s. And this is a thing, too. There are a lot of metal fans that don't like change and don't like when bands kind of move with the times. And they want everything to sound like the 80s. And they want Dokken to sound like the 80s. And they're very suspicious if bands change their sound. And sometimes, yeah, sometimes bands do it and they're just following a trend. But there's a fine line between following a trend and evolving or adapting with the times, you know? I mean, the Beatles didn't sound like the early Beatles by the late 60s, you know? They weren't doing I Want to Hold Your Hand in 1969, you know? So it's just like bands evolve and they change their sounds. And anyway, yeah, there's some bands like AC/DC and Motorhead that once they kind of got it, and they kind of kept with that, more or less. But then there's some bands which they evolve and kind of change with the times. And I don't see why a melodic band like Dokken, a melodic hard rock, bordering on metal at times band like Dokken, wouldn't be one of those bands that shouldn't change with the times. And in fact, I mean, they already did it. I mean, them going a little more, what if you want to call it alternative rock with this album, isn't any different than when they want more hair metal with Under Lock and Key. I mean, especially if you watch that old footage of them in Germany, like I told you about, they were more like an alternative rock band then. If anything, it was more of a sellout move to go hair metal in the mid '80s. Like that's when they changed their image. They put hairspray, in, and they made their songs a little slicker and poppier. So Dokken had already kind of done that, So it's just that was a time period, because they were still a new band. People were more accepting of them changing that sound, and they didn't really know what they sounded like before. God, listen to the Back in the Streets EP. They sound nothing like a hair metal band. They just sound, if anything, they sound kind of punky on that EP. So, I mean, Dokken has already kind of evolved a few times, even before we got into the 90s. Plus, I wouldn't call this a grunge album by any means. Now, maybe the one afterwards, we'll talk about that. There are some grunge moments on that, for sure. But this one, I call this more just a kind of vaguely experimental hard rock album. And, Don Dokken is a guy who loves British hard rock from the 60s, the British Invasion stuff, loves the Beatles. Both him and George Lynch were big Jeff Beck fans, and the Yardbirds and things like that. Why shouldn't he do an album that's somewhat Beatlesque? And that's the thing. Some people have compared this, said this is like Dokken meets the Beatles. And you hear it right out with the gate with Inside Looking Out, which is kind of heavy. It has some heavy guitar work, but it has this really almost Beatlesque melody. But Dokken was always about melody, and he always had these nice harmonies. So to me, it feels like a natural progression. And this was supposedly, like I said earlier, it was supposed to be a solo album, but none of the band, even George Lynch and Lynch Mob, did respectable business, but they weren't making like Dokken numbers. And Dokken's solo album, Up From the Ashes, didn't make a lot of money. So everyone would kind of want it, okay, maybe we made a mistake, maybe we should do a reunion. So, and Don Dokken was already kind of putting this together, and Mick Brown and Jeff Pilson had started working with him again on this album and started co-writing songs, and they were doing it. And then they finally, the management, and they got George Lynch in there. Now, Don says George only came in towards the end and threw some guitar stuff on, but he does have a handful of songwriting credits on this. So, I don't know, the truth might be somewhere in the middle there. I feel like George probably did come in last, but he definitely came in to co-write and do some more things, especially some songs. One of my favorite songs on the album, Lesser of Two Evils, that's like classic George Lynch kind of stuff going on with the guitar work. That's the most Dokken-esque sounding song on the album. It's also my favorite song on the album. It's great. I love that song. But Inside Looking Out and Hole in My Head, that's a cool, trippy kind of Dokken meets the Beatles song. And hey, I love the Beatles, so maybe that's another reason why I don't mind this direction of the album. The Maze, great song. Great song. Starts off soft, but kind of gets a little heavier and powerful. Really great songwriting. Too High to Fly, that was the one single from this album, which I think it was just single. I don't think they did it. Maybe they did a video. I don't know. If they did, let me know. Because I'd like, I don't know why. I could never find one on YouTube. I looked a few times. But so maybe they didn't. But anyway, Too High to Fly, catchy song. In very mid-90s, while still being Dokken, but just Dokken in the 90s, like a band that just evolved their sound. And it's really catchy. I love the song. It's actually the only song from this album that they still play live. And Nothing Left to Say, that's good. It's all good. Sweet Change, like I said, Lesser of Two Evils. This is a really great album. And if you're open-minded and aren't just about everything sounding like the 80s, if you could accept a band evolving, especially a talented group of individuals like these guys, and that have songwriting skills and don't want to just do the same thing again and again, then listen to Dysfunctional. It's a great album, and I think it's one of their best albums. And then we get to 1997, Shadow Life. Now this, if the other album is controversial, this album is just, I would say, almost universally despised. This is generally thought of as Dokken's worst album, or at least it's the worst album that people have actually maybe listened to, because there might be some later ones that maybe I think no one has really listened to. But this album, and not that a lot of people listen to this album. I mean, if you know about this album, you're someone that might be watching this video. But anyway, so this is the album that they call the grunge album. Most people call it the grunge album. And if you can definitely hear it on the first song, Puppet on the String, why people would say that. But I liken this is as much a grunge album as Kiss's Dynasty is a disco album. Like, it has that rep. People go, Dynasty's the disco album. But you know, there's really only 2, maybe 3 songs on that album that are really kind of like disco hybrid rock, where for the most part it's pretty much a straight up Kiss sounding hard rock. But because one of the songs was the main single from the album and the lead song on the album, I Was Made for Loving You, it kind of created a stigma that this was the Kiss disco album, even though it really was a hard rockin' album for the most part. I think likewise, this just replaced disco with grunge. This is an album that has much more of a grunge reputation than I think it deserves. Now, I understand it, especially because the first song has this kind of Alice in Chains sounding thing going on with the bass. The Jeff Pilson suddenly mixed up really loud, and it sounds like they're trying to make like wood, you know, from Alice in Chains. And Don Dokken singing with that grunge mid-90s effect on his vocals. You know, there was kind of this staticky walkie-talkie effect that was popular at that time period. So it's very dated. It's not a horrible song, but it doesn't sound like Dokken. It sounds like lesser Alice in Chains. Not great. I love Alice in Chains, you know, and this ain't on Alice in Chains level. And it's too bad because you think, well, Dokken should be able to do Alice in Chains stuff because like Alice in Chains, they have great harmonies and great songwriting and they have great guitars. So they should be able to, but I don't know, maybe this just isn't him. Apparently, George Lynch and Jeff Pilson were the ones that pushed the grunge direction a little more. Like I said, George Lynch is kind of the trendier guy in the band. Amazing, ingenious guitarist, but kind of a trendy guy, you know. Maybe not as bad as Tommy Lee and Nikki Sixx, but still kind of a trendy guy. And so he was pushing on that. And there's the worst song on the album is a song called Hello, and that is definitely like an attempt to do a grunge song. And that's horrible. It's a piece of shit. Now, but the reputation of this album, you would think the whole album was songs like this. And it's not. I gotta tell you, this might be controversial. It's definitely not one of their best albums. It's definitely a big drop-off after Dysfunctional. But it's not the piece of shit that people say. I actually think it's a little bit better than a few later albums that we're going to discuss. And I see potential there. And in fact, there's actually a few songs I like. For the most part, this feels like with the exception of those couple grunge songs, this feels like a natural follow-up to Dysfunctional. It's more kind of hippie-ish, kind of psychedelic hard rock for the most part. And again, some people's definition of grunge too, especially older metalheads from the 80s, they kind of think anything that's like 90s alternative rock is grunge, you know? Anything that's not like 80s metal they call grunge, you know? So I think they have a very loose definition. Like I said, Up on the String and Hello are definitely like an attempts at grunge songs. But for the most part, most of this stuff is kind of that Beatle-esque kind of hippy-dippy, psychedelic hard rock sound that they had in Dysfunctional. It's not as strong as that album. But there are a few songs. If anything, I'd say it's more, there's a band, which I'm a big fan of. I've especially gotten into them in recent years, their back catalog. It's Screaming Trees. You might know them from the song Nearly Lost You. I almost feel like what Dokken's doing here, and a little bit on the last album, is kind of like Screaming Trees stuff, where it's kind of like a harder rockin' version of 60s rock, you know? And there's a lot of moment like that. Cracks in the Ground is like that, Sky Beneath My Feet. My favorite song on the album is a great song called I Feel. I love this song, I Feel, and it's just got great, strong Don Dokken type melodies, but with this trippy kind of cool hard rock song behind it, and it's very Screaming Trees-ish, and that kind of, to me, that fits, that sounds like what Dokken should sound like in the mid-90s. You know, I feel like Dokken should be kind of like the Screaming Trees in the mid-90s. I feel like a mixture of that kind of British invasion influence, you know, but a little more hard rock, and that and pathos. Like I said, Don Dokken was never Mr. Party Girls and stuff like Motley Crue in the 80s anyway. He was kind of a gloomy guy and kind of introspective. So I don't feel like, I feel that Don Dokken should be doing stuff like this in the mid-90s. And it feels like a natural progression. And that's a great song. And I think if a younger band in the 90s had done that for a cool video, I feel like that could have actually been a hit. And, you know, there's some acoustic stuff. Not everything's great. I think the biggest problem with this album is just that it sounds kind of rushed. And some of the songs sound kind of incomplete. A little like another mid-90s wannabe grunge album, even more so than this, because this is just a couple songs that I think are grungy. The Kiss's Carnival of Souls. This is a little like that, where it feels like it's not complete. It just doesn't sound like a complete album. So that's kind of its biggest problem. I feel like if they had restrained a little of the grunge impulses and focused more on the Screaming Trees-esque kind of psychedelic rock side and just fleshed out the songs a little bit more. And maybe if George and Don were, not falling apart again, which apparently they were, I feel like this could have been a much better follow-up to Dysfunctional. But as a result, it's just kind of a half-assed, not quite all the way there album with some good moments, some bad moments, and it's kind of a mixed bag, but not as bad as its reputation, in my opinion. George Lynch, he fucks off. He's like, enough of this. But this time, it's just him. Jeff and Mick actually stay in the band, and they get a new guitarist. They get Reb Beach. Hey, Reb Beach, I talked about him in my Whitesnake video. He did a lot of stuff with Whitesnake earlier on, and periodically he'd do stuff with Winger. He's Winger's guitarist. He is a great guitarist, and I think he's probably, he's the second best guitarist that has played with Dokken after George Lynch. Of course, you gotta go with George Lynch first. But Reb Beach was a good replacement, and it's good because he kind of filled in that role that George Lynch did, but without being like a George Lynch clone, which we'll remember that because we'll get to that in a few years. But like he still brought kind of his own style. And Erase the Slate is a really good album. In fact, this is easily their best album after Dysfunctional. And it's a really good album. I wouldn't say it's a great album. There's a few tracks that are just so-so, but nothing really bad. But when it is great, it's great. Like the opening track, Erase the Slate. Woo! Now that's almost like a tooth and nail era rocker, but with a 90s kind of production and a slightly less fancy guitarist. Like Reb Beach he's got skills, don't get me wrong, but he's not quite as, he doesn't have quite the dexterity and flair as George Lynch, but still, he's a great straight-ahead hard rock guitarist. And Erase the Slate is a great metal tune. I love that. Change the World's catchy. I even like Maddest Hatter, even though that's kind of a stupid name for a song, but it's cool. Drown. Shattered. Oh, I love that. Probably the title track and Shattered are my two favorite songs on this album. And they do a so-so cover of that song from Three Dog Night 1, which Harry Nilsson wrote. Who Believes, Voice in the Sky, Crazy Mary Goes Around, which is a song that Mick Brown sings, which is all right, little fun rocker. The second half is not quite as strong as the first half, but for the most part, it's a nice mixture of a lot of different styles. There's some hard rock songs, there's some heavy metal, there's some kind of Beatle-esque ballads, acoustic ballads and stuff. So it's a little bit of a mixture. It's a little bit, if anything, this is kind of like a hybrid of their 80s sound with the mid-90s dysfunctional sound. It's a little bit like those two sides come together, and it sounds to me like this is what Dokken should sound like in 1999. It's a really good album, and if you think Dokken's like over with in the 80s, and maybe Dysfunctional's too Beatle-esque for you, I would push you towards this album because this is kind of like a hybrid between the two sounds. It's got enough 80s metal qualities to it that you'd probably like it if you like 80s music, but yet if you're a little open-minded, then there's some other stuff going on as well. It's a really good album, and it's too bad it has a really shitty album cover, as you can see, with that little kid. That's unfortunate, but I will say this, as shitty as that album cover is, it's a little bit better than the next album cover, 2002, Long Way Home. At first I thought this was like a stoner dude. I had to look closely to see it was actually a girl. She looks kind of like, I don't know, it looks like Jay and Silent Bob, with that hat. And it's all right. I mean, the idea of having like a model girl with angel wings, kind of naked like this is not a bad concept for a heavy metal album cover, but just do something, make it kind of sexy or cool, because don't just have her just kind of sitting there. Like she's just kind of slumping there, looking kind of bored. It's just like, it's a bad drawing too. And you just look at it and you just go, oh, okay. Is this what you're coming at me with? Just some girl like, oh man, not their worst album cover. Oh, but I should have mentioned, Jeff Pilson's out of the band. Now, even he hanged in there for a bit, but finally he's like, nah, screw it, I'm sick of work. Apparently Reb Beach is too. Reb only worked with Don Dokken on one album and was like, and Don was honest about this. Don said in a recent interview that that Reb Beach said, nah, I'll never make an album with you again. You're just too much of a pain in the ass. Don Dokken's just too much of a perfectionist, and he drove him crazy. So he was like, fuck that, later. So Don Dokken, again, without a bassist and a guitar. So he gets a new bassist. This guy hangs in there for a while, Barry Sparks, who does a very good Jeff Pilson impersonation. Like, he does the backing vocals and sounds very similar to him, actually. And John Norum, who was Europe's guitarist, if you recall, who played on Up From the Ashes. So he brings him back. So he's like, hey, John Norum, yeah, come back. I hope you forgive me for not doing anything with you after Up From the Ashes. So they do this album, and it's definitely one of their weakest albums. It's, especially after Erase the Slate, this is a big drop-off. And actually, I think this is worse than Shadowlands. There's nothing like I feel on this album that really sticks out that I really like. And it's just very generic. It doesn't even really sound like Dokken. The only thing that makes it sound like Dokken is that Don Dokken's singing it. It just sounds kind of like fairly generic metal / hard rock. It's not bad. There's nothing really bad about it. There's nothing like as bad as the album cover, like in terms of the songs, but they're all just kind of forgettable. So you got Under the Gun is kind of a decent rocker. There's an alright cover of Yardbird's Heart Full of Soul, better than the one cover actually, I think, from the last album. Oh, there is one song I like a lot. Everybody Needs Somebody. Everybody Needs to Be With Someone. That's very Yardbirds meets Beatles, kind of like the Byrds actually too. It sounds like the song The Byrds. It sounds like a song the Byrds would have done in the '60s. And that's just, it has a nice like "And Your Bird Can Sing" kind of vibe to it. I really like that, and that sounds like something that could have been on Dysfunctional or Shadowland. And I like that song. That's not bad, but the rest of this is just, overall, I just call this album nothing special and a big drop off after Erase the Slate. And then Dokken needs to kind of regroup. It's time to get another guitarist. He never uses this Europe guitarist more than once in a row. And this is where John Levine, is that it? Or is it Levin? Levin. It's Levin. Levin? Yeah, I guess there's no E at the end. So it's John Levin. Okay, so John Levin. John Levin was an entertainment lawyer. Yeah, I don't know if he was Don's entertainment lawyer, but he was an entertainment lawyer for a lot of entertainers. But when he was a young person, he was an aspiring guitarist, and one of his heroes was George Lynch. He loved George Lynch, and he learned how to play like George Lynch. All these years later, somehow him and Don Dokken get together. This lawyer, who used to play like George Lynch back when he was younger, and played on a few, he did some session work, I believe. He's like, hey, Don, hey, I can sound like George Lynch. And Don's like, hey, it's great, because it'd be great to have a guitarist that sounds like George Lynch, who's not George Lynch. So they get together, and to his credit, John Levin is a really, really good guitarist, and he can do it. He can sound like George Lynch at times, not quite on that level, and he definitely does not have George's inventiveness, because he's just kind of mimicking what he's doing. I think he's got a little more of his own personality, say Tommy Thayer, who's just kind of mimicking Ace Frehley and Kiss, but for the most part, not so much on this album. We'll get to that in the next album. This album, it's like George Lynch with a little bit of modern influences. It's not exactly a total replication, but you hear a little bit more of that guitar style than you had since George Lynch was in the band. Anyway, his album, the first album that John Levin is on, is 2004's Hell to Pay. Hey, look, an actual cool album cover. Dokken hasn't had a cool album cover since Beast from the East. So, whoa, good on you, Dokken, an actual cool album cover. I like the guy shaking Satan's hand. It's just cool to get Satan in there. I like it, a little tooth and nail-ish, a little more comic booky than that album cover, but still cool. I like it. So, promising. Cool album cover. Okay, album. Definitely better than the last one, and better than Shadow Life or Shadowland or Shadow, whatever, that Shadow mid-90s album that I like more than most people, but forget the name of. But not great, just kind of all right. I kind of respect this album. I respect it more than I like it, in the sense that he's not doing a full-fledged retro thing, even though the album cover looks a little retro and the guitarist has more of a Lynch sound. He's still kind of trying to be a little modern, while still being true to himself, and the songs are melodic, and I love the second song. It does sound kind of like a Tooth and Nail era kind of rocker. It's faster. Don't Bring Me Down. That's a really cool song. Escape. It's a really catchy mid-tempo melodic song. I really like that song. Haunted's really cool. Actually, maybe I feel like this album's it's growing on me just looking at the track listing. Haunted's cool. Haunted, actually, it does that little bit of bluesiness that George Lynch kind of hinted upon with like Heaven Sent. Like in Haunted, it's a little bluesy, but then it's kind of a rockin' song. And he does some really cool licks on this song. John does some really good licks. Don't really like Prozac Nation too much. Care for You is a nice little ballad, some nice songs. Overall, not as good as Erase the Slate, but it's the best album after Erase the Slate, in my opinion. And it's kind of a grower. For the most part, it's a little too mid-tempo, the exception of Don't Bring Me Down. But some of the songs, even the ballads, they're interesting. They're interesting kind of Beatle-esque ballads. And I think the songwriting's decent. And it's a solid, if not spectacular, album. Then we get to Lightning Strikes Again. 2008, Lightning Strikes Again. Hey, that's a song title from Under Lock and Key. And hey, look at that album cover. It looks like the Back for the Attack dragon coat of arms thing. So Back for the Attack dragon, Under Lock and Key song. Obviously the album is going for a big time retro thing. And there's a reason for that, because the music is going for a big time retro thing. In fact, this is really the only, this is like the only post, I would say, after Up From the Ashes. This is the most Dokken sounding Dokken album you're going to get. If by Dokken sounding, I mean, their 80s stuff, this is what people think of as classic Dokken. And John Levin is really sounding like George Lynch on this album, big time, with the guitar tone, and it has a great production. And in fact, the first 3 songs, you're thinking, whoa, this is like one of their best albums in a long time. Definitely their best since Erase the Slate. Standing on the Outside, catchy. It's a little more the Under Lock and Key side than the Back for the Attack side that the album cover is making you think it might be. It's a little more the melodic side, a little poppier, but it has the little finger tapping thing in the beginning, classic kind of George Lynchian sounding guitar thing going on. And it's a really catchy chorus. I love that chorus. And the second song's really good. Give Me a Reason, that's a great song. And Heart to Stone. Not Heart of Stone. Like I said, there's a lot of songs called Heart of Stone. And maybe Don Dokken was aware of this. So he made this Heart to Stone. And that's a really good song too. The first 3 songs are really, really good. And you're like, yeah, this is a good classic Dokken sounding album. I don't respect it as much as the last few albums because they're obviously going for a retro thing. But hey, it's catchy. And I do like that sound, so I don't mind it. But then things kind of start to fall apart a little bit. Disease is just kind of it's like that's trying to sound like a modern metal song, I guess, and it's just not that good. How I Miss Your Smile is kind of a limp ballad, not one of his better ballads. I like the song Oasis, that's a good song, and that's really the last good song on this album, and that's kind of the problem. After Oasis, the second side, there's a real big drop-off. A lot of just kind of forgettable ballads. In kind of mediocre mid-tempo songs. It ends weakly. This Fire is kind of a weak song, I think. It's very mid-tempo. Like even the last album had like at least one fast song. The second song was fast, This doesn't have any fast songs. It's all very slow. It's kind of sluggish. Also, Don singing, it's not as problematic as it will become with the next and final album. But you could tell he's not all that into it. Like he sounds like a guy that's like, okay, you want me to sound like Dokken from the 80s, so I'll do it. So he doesn't sound as inspired as he has on the past few albums. And he's doing an all right job. It's professional. The whole thing about this album is very professional. The production's great. In fact, I think this is probably their best production. Yeah, it's their best production since Dysfunctional. The guitar sounds sharp. The drums sound great. It has a great sound, but I just think the songs don't bring it. And the second half is a real kind of chore to almost get through. It's really sluggish, and it just sounds kind of uninspired for the most part, which it's too bad because it started off very promising, especially that first track, Standing on the Outside, sounds like a modern-day classic Dokken song. But the rest of this album is just not. I still like it better than A Long Way Home, but I actually think Hell to Pay is actually a little bit better and a little more interesting. And then we get to the last new Dokken album, Broken Bones. This one I don't own, and it's actually not even available anymore. I mean, I could if I went to eBay or the Amazon Marketplace, but I've sampled it, like I listened to it twice in my life, and that was enough. I don't want to be mean here. This is the thing. And I've seen Dokken, this lineup of Dokken, I saw them actually play at the Rainbow in the parking lot one night. And let's just say Don's having a lot of problems. He can't really sing anymore. And, Don, he never had Rob Halford range, as I pointed out earlier, but he had there were certain things he could do and pull off, which he just can't pull off anymore. And as the songs get less heavy and get a little slower and get even gloomy by Don Dokken standards, and this album's very gloomy and kind of slow, and you can hear parts here and there, some parts where John Livin sounds like he's doing a few cool guitar lines, and you can kind of hear how this is kind of like a Dokken song. It is actually a decent cover of Jefferson Airplane's Today, where I think Don sings kind of nicely, although unfortunately there's this annoying techno drum in the background. But his voice is all right on that. But for the most part, he just sounds tired. There's a few times where he's trying to sound like he's trying to sound bluesy, but Don Dokken never sounded bluesy, so it just doesn't work. And you could just hear a man struggling. You just hear a man struggling, and it's kind of sad to listen to. And so this is an album I don't intend to ever buy. Fortunately, we do not have to end on bare bones because of this new release that I'm going to talk about right now. The Lost Songs, 1978 to 1981. So as I said at the top of this video, this is a compilation album, just came out the other week. There were some old demos that Don spruced up a bit, added some new vocals too. The 3 songs he did that too, and then there was a couple old tracks that he dusted off, and Back in the Streets EP, which was a bootleg of a handful of songs he did with a pre-classic Dokken lineup band. And he recorded in Germany, I believe. And that stuff has a really raw, almost punk meets power pop quality to it. It sounds very different from Dokken, even kind of different from, you hear a little bit of it, shades of it on Breaking the Chains. But for the most part, it's a very different kind of band. And I love it. I always loved that EP, and I only heard it on YouTube before. I never actually had a copy of it. And fortunately, Don didn't have the original masters for it, so all you could do was just remaster it. You couldn't remix it or add new vocals, so that's good. So you get just kind of a remastered version of that EP. It gets kind of spread around here, and at first I wasn't sure I liked that they didn't have it in its entirety. But, that was never officially released anyway. I like, actually, the running order on this, and I like how it all kind of works as an album. And even the stuff with the newer vocals, and I wasn't even sure if they were newer until I heard them next to the Back in the Street stuff, and it's really clear that, yeah, that was young Don. And young Don didn't sound as great as he did in the mid-'80s. His voice is very high. He does sound a bit like Mickey Mouse, but it's still, he has a little more energy and power to his voice than he has later on or now. Although I will say this, the first song, which was also the first single release from this, Step Into the Light. Step Into Light's a great song. I love this song. It's a little subtle, but still very catchy in its sneaky kind of way. The music's great. The guitar works great. And I will say this, it's definitely, Don's vocals do not sound like they used to, but they're a lot better than they sounded on Bare Bones. It sounds like he's trying more, and he's finding a nice way to be melodic and pleasing to the ear with his limitations, The other song, No Answer, he doesn't sound great on that. But the guitars are really cool in that. I like the guitar riffs on that song. Rainbow's also, it's kind of close to Step Into the Light. He does a decent job, I think, the old Don on that song. And it's a dark song. It's really dark and heavy. You think it's called Rainbows, and it's like really depressing. Then you have the Back in the Street songs, We're Going Wrong. I love that song. It's so heavy. And the original version of Felony, which is heavy, and Back in the Streets was a great song. I love that song. It's almost like the new wave of British heavy metal, but by an American band in Germany. Yeah, it's just got that rawness to it. It's catchy, but very visceral and very straight and to the point. And you can hear that this sounds like a young, passionate, and ambitious kid that likes the Scorpions and Saxon, and he's gonna make a cool record. And I would have been interesting to hear that band kind of go on and make an album, but we never got that. Instead, they kind of reconfigured. He got a new lineup and had Breaking the Chains. And there's this great song also called Hit and Run, which sounds like it might have been from the Breaking the Chains era. And that's a really cool song. And that sounded like that could have been definitely a good album track, so I don't see why they scrapped that. But this is a very raw version of it. Sounds like a really rough thing they did in the studio, and obviously this was the best he can probably the best sounding version of the song that Don had available. But hell, even rough, I like it. Plus, I sometimes, I like that rough stuff. I like the new wave British heavy metal, and I can even sometimes listen to a little bit of early black metal and stuff. So, and some punk, so in indie rock. So I don't mind roughness, especially if there's a really good song buried in the roughness. And Hit and Run is definitely an example of that. And overall, I really, really like this album. I say it's a really good album. Not great, but good. And if you want to hear the earlier, scrappier side of Don Dokken mixed in with some new stuff like Step Into the Light, which is like a mixture of the old and new, and well done, then I say this is good. If you count this, this is easily the best thing since Erase the Slate, if you want to count this as an album, although I know technically it's a compilation. But it's really good, and I recommend it. If you're a Dokken fan, definitely get it. I've listened to it already a bunch of times, and I really enjoy listening to it. And I'm just going to add, I'm not going to talk about every live album, but I will talk about 3 key live albums that I like that I will recommend. My favorite live album is actually not Beast from the East. I do like Beast from the East, and that is one of the 3. You should definitely get Beast from the East. It has an awesome album cover, and it's Dokken at the height of their career with the classic lineup, and George Lynch at the peak of his powers, in my opinion. And they play every great Dokken song you would want them to play, and it's a great set list. And George Lynch is, does this epic solo that goes into Mr. Scary, and it's great. The only issue I have Beast from the East is it has a kind of late 80s live production. So unlike the 70s and the very early 80s, live albums didn't sound that great in the late 80s. I don't know, in the early 90s. They started to sound kind of weak and thin. And this album, I feel the production sounds a little thin, and it doesn't sound as beefy as it should have. And, it's like, I think one thing, live albums in the 70s were like as popular, if not more popular. In some cases, they were more popular than the studio albums. It was like the era of the live albums. These productions just sounded much better, the live albums. So by the late 80s, it sounded like live albums were just made for the fans. Like they just didn't have that same power to them. But that being said, Beast from the East is definitely one of the better live albums from the late 80s. And you still, the band is at the top of their powers. It's high energy, but still not my favorite. It's my second favorite live Dokken album. My favorite Dokken live album is one that came out a few years back called From Conception, Live 1981. Now this is from the Breaking the Chains tour. It's actually from a 1983 show. It was proven to be that this is a lie. I don't know why, but for some sneaky reason, I'm sure he had his reasons, Don Dokken called this Live 1981 and said that it was pre-Breaking the Chains. But it's, Jeff Pilson said, no, this is from an 83 show, and he's kind of backed up for several reasons. Hey, Jeff Pilson wasn't even playing in the band in 81. The set list is what their set list was in 83, and even the songs are at, some of these songs were different in 81 than they were in 83, and these are clearly the 83 versions. Plus, on top of that, there's even a moment before Breaking the Chains where Don Dokken says, you see, this is our video on MTV. They didn't have a video for Breaking the Chains in 81, and it wasn't shown on MTV because they didn't have it. So that it's obviously a 1983 recording. So for whatever reason, some legal reason, I'm sure, to cut some people out of money, probably. I don't know. But for whatever reason, 81 Conception is an 83 album. But that all aside, all that sneaky stuff Don's up to doing aside, it's a great album, and it's my favorite live album. And, this is the closest you're going to get to hearing that raw, early version of Breaking the Chains, with a beefier production. Because this production sounds beefy, and this sounds heavier. It sounds better than Beast from the East. Beast from the East definitely has better songs, definitely a better set list, but the sound of this album is so good, and it kicks off with Paris is Burning, and it just sounds so heavy, and to hear this band, to hear Dokken at this heavy stage, young and hungry, and it's got such energy to it, and it's better than Breaking the Chains to me. So if you feel like listening to a heavier, more beefed up version of Breaking the Chains, listen to From Conception Live 1981, and so I definitely recommend that. And another live album, the last album I'm going to talk about, is One Live Night from 1996, which is a semi-acoustic album they did after doing Dysfunctional. So it's a classic Dokken lineup touring for one of my favorite albums. I think their best album in the 90s and their best post Back for the Attack album, Dysfunctional. And they do a couple songs in that. Mainly they do classics. But what I really love about this album is that you get to hear different kinds of, you get to hear a different spin on the material because it's acoustic. Now, George Lynch is largely electric and he's doing his solos, but Don and Jeff Pilson are playing acoustic guitar. So it's got, you know, and I think Mick Brown's hitting some bongos or something. So it's got this really intimate vibe. And what I like about it is it shows you what I've been saying from the beginning. The Dokken writes really great songs that ultimately, and that's the real test, like, is the song still good even when it's not heavy, even when it's played with acoustic guitars? Does the song come through, you know? And you know, Into the Fire, Unchained the Night, Tooth and Nail, even they do a slower down acoustic version of that. Just Got Lucky, which Jeff Pilson does lead vocals, great lead vocals on, and Alone Again, In My Dreams, and It's Not Love. And let me tell you, these songs all remain great songs. Even stripped down, they're just great songs. Just like if the Beatles wrote some great songs, you know, they wouldn't matter if it was electric or acoustic, a great song's a great song. And that's one of the things I love about this album. And so especially, it's nice. You want to chill out like Sunday afternoon and hear a more mellow side of Dokken, then listen to this album. I definitely recommend it. And that's, you know, they released other live albums after that, all of which, you know, are all right, but not as good as these three live albums that I just pitched you. And that's pretty much it. That's Dokken. So great band. I think an underrated band, an undervalued band. And if you want to get into them, definitely start with Tooth and Nail and Back for the Attack. Get their 80s stuff and then branch out and get like Dysfunctional and Erase the Slate. Overall, I think there's something kind of sad about Dokken. You know, it's sad that they didn't have fun in the 80s. It's sad that they always fought. It's sad that they never quite hit what I think they should have hit career-wise. But at the same time, part of their sadness is part of what gives them that kind of majestic quality, that their pathos. That's the Dokken pathos, is that almost Dokken star-crossed. They're a star-crossed band. So maybe Dokken was never supposed to be as big as Motley Crue or Def Leppard. They wouldn't be the star-crossed band that they are and the star-crossed band that I love. So good on you, Dokken. Some great records. And thanks for my brother for getting me into them all those years ago. Rockin' with Dokken. And I will see you later. Rock on.